Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to today's Jewish Gen Talk with Chaya Sarah Herman. So glad that you're here. As we always do, please, we ask that you please post in the chat where you are logging in from. We have people who registered from around the world, and we'd love to know where you're from, and we will get started in just a few moments. You have Trish in Bloomington, Indiana, Michael in Raleigh, North Carolina, Lisa in Washington, D.C., Monique in Oakville, Ontario, and Scott from Glasgow, Scotland. Welcome, Scott. We have Barbara Rice, Jewish Education, I believe, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Eileen Goldman from Orange County. Connie Fisher from Corona, California. Susan in Tucson, Arizona. Jill in San Francisco. And we have Simon in Lakewood, New Jersey, and Leslie in Lexington, Kentucky. And welcome everybody who's logging in. Please post a message in the chat where you are logging in from. We're so happy you're here. We have Bob in Maryland. We have Jeff in the Middle Valley in California. We have Chaya Friedman from Hawaii. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce the place. Never been there. I'd love to go. We have Shana in Jerusalem, in Israel. We have Rachel in East Bridgewater, Massachusetts. We have Steve in Fairfax, Virginia. We have another Steve in Ann Arbor. We have Karen in Barcelona. Wow, so glad that you're with us. We have Christina in the Scottish Highlands. We have Ben in Netanya, Israel. We have Karen in Zurich. We have Steve in Rehovot, Massachusetts, not in Israel. We have Ruth Barina in Israel. Judy in Syracuse, Renee Garbus, always nice to have you with us, a former Neshama program participant in Franklin Lakes, New Jersey. Welcome everybody. We're going to get started in today's Jewish Gen Talk. You can please leave a message in the chat. Just let everybody know where you are from. We have people who registered from around the world. My name is Avram Grohl, and I am privileged to oversee Jewish Gen, which is the genealogical research division of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, based in New York City. Today's talk is part of our ongoing series of Jewish Gen Talk educational webinars, and we are really pleased to be joined today by Chaya Sarah Herman, who is one of the genealogists at our Jewish Genealogy Research Center, the Peter and Mary Calico Jewish Genealogy Research Center here at the museum. Chaya Sarah is a professional genealogist based in Brooklyn, New York. She comes from a long line of immigrants, and she came and as a teenager, she became passionate about tracing her own family roots back to modern-day Lithuania, England, Belarus, Ukraine, Germany, Poland, and Russia. Her research has been featured in articles published in Mishpacha magazine since 2021 in both their English and Hebrew editions. And this year, she joined our team at Jewish Gen at the Calico Center at the Museum of Jewish Heritage and has quickly distinguished herself for her expertise and has become quite well known. The webinar will focus on unique documents and process and historical context related to Jewish immigration and naturalization. We will cover key records such as passenger lists and naturalization files, and you will gain insight into how these records can be used to trace your family history. So this will be a wonderful program. Chaya Sarah, we're so happy you're here with us. Chaya Sarah has graciously offered to answer questions at the end of the program. Please put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. We will not be looking through the chat for questions. The session will be recorded, and we will send it out as a follow-up to this program, if not today, then hopefully before the end of the week. So with that, welcome everybody. So glad that you're here. Chaya Sarah, I pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me get you the slides so we can start. Here we go. Okay. Can everybody see the slides? Okay, Rami?
You have your notes on.
Okay, let's see. How did we get? Give me 1 second.
You can see the next slide.
Give me 2 seconds. We did just try this to make sure, but hold on. Let me restart this actual slideshow over here and see if we can do it like that. Give me a second. Sorry about that. Technical difficulty. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, so we're going to go here. And then we're going to start here. And
there you go. That's perfect.
We're still good?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great, amazing. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. I cannot believe there are 400 of you who decided to spend your day before Thanksgiving with us here, but I'm so happy you did. And this is our webinar, Introduction to U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Records. And my name, as Rami said, is Kaisar Herman. So first of all, what are we going to cover today in this webinar? Immigration and naturalization records are among the most useful documents that can be used to inform Jewish genealogical research, at least on the US end. Today, we will introduce the following types of documents, and we'll discuss some of the history about what goes into them. Due to time purposes, we can't go into, obviously, every different type of ship manifest. We can't go into every different year and every different document that is in all the possibilities in naturalization. Both of these topics you could probably spend weeks on, but as an introduction, I want to introduce you to the idea of these and what these look like when you're first doing your searches and you're looking at these documents and how I want you to approach them. For immigration records, we're going to be looking at primarily ship passenger lists, which is the most common type of immigration record that you will probably be finding. The second, to a lesser extent, I'm going to touch on border crossing cards. For naturalization records, I'm really going to focus on the Declaration of Intention, which is also known as the first papers. And also in that same file, typically in the naturalization file, would be the petition for naturalization, also known as the final or second papers. So before we get started really on looking at those documents, let's make sure that we have our terms all sorted. What is immigration? Immigration is the act of traveling into another country for the purpose of permanent residence there. So if someone is traveling for vacation, for work, that is not immigration, though sometimes those records, depending on the database you're using or kind of the place you're accessing those records, they might kind of categorize them all as immigration records. Or on one record, you might have what is for one person an immigration record, and for another, it's just a record that they traveled to a certain place. But immigration is specifically for the purposes of permanent residence. Naturalization is the process of becoming a US citizen for a person who was not or did not receive birthright citizenship, except in very specific circumstances. So these are some of the milestones that I wanted to kind of point out in terms of, and I'm going to go through in more detail most of these points, but just to give you a kind of brief overview of some years to kind of keep in your mind in your research. The first being 1790. The Naturalization Act of 1790 established, this was the first time there was any established federal process how someone could become a naturalized citizen. And that person had to be a free white man, just to be specific. In 1795, that is when we have the first kind of start of what would become the naturalization files and the process which started from 1795 and continued until about 1952. A declaration was required as the first step in the process of foregoing subjecthood in one nation and becoming an American citizen. But first, before you got those citizen privileges, you had to say in open court, this is my intent. And that is the start of one of the first naturalization documents we're going to talk about. In 1820. So this is good to know for immigration purposes. This is when the US started requiring steamship companies to actually create passenger manifests. Now, this will not apply for most Jews unless you are maybe from a very old Dutch or Sephardi family. Most Jews in America did not come before 1820. Nevertheless, you should know that this is when these records actually started being kept. I have here in 1880. 1880 is when the largest wave of Jewish immigration started. This is not to say, obviously, that there were not Jews before. As I said, before 1880, there was large portions of German Jews, particularly who came to this country, starting in about the 1840s and 1850s. But 1880 to about 1920 is when the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews in particular came to this country. So the majority of people will be from that time, have come from that time period. Not everyone, but the majority. The next year, 1892, this is when Ellis Island opens for business. Good to know. Now, most records you're going to find, databases will often combine these. However, you all will find in specific specific collections that will be for the Castle Garden, which will have up till 1891 approximately, and then some will have continuing from Ellis Island. But even I think on the Ellis Island database today, I think that you can access both of all those combined records. But it's still good to know. 1906, this is kind of like the golden year for genealogical records. I don't know if it was a golden year for our ancestors, but it was for those records. This was the year the immigration and naturalization forms were standardized and expanded due to multiple different acts of Congress that were enacted. At this point, only federal courts could grant citizenship as opposed to any court of record, be it city, county, or state, etc., probate court, whatever your local court. This codified that it had to be a very specific federal court that could naturalize someone. And it expanded those manifests. And we're going to go into more detail on both of those topics in a bit. As we said, the end of the large wave of immigration to the US for Jews and non-Jews, to be honest, was between 1920 and 1924. And the reason for that is because during this time, multiple immigration laws were passed, basically to curtail the amount of immigration that could come into the country for a lot of different political reasons. To some extent, there was one in 1920, a much harsher one in 1921, and then subsequent until 1924. So after that, there were very specific circumstances how someone got to this country, and there might be a more interesting story how they got their visas or how they got here. You never know. In the last date I have here for the purposes of this webinar is 1940, and the Nationality Act of 1940, among other things, changed all the forms for naturalization. This changed a lot of things in terms of how the forms are categorized and some of the underlying processes that went on. Not necessarily. Now, from year 1939 to 1941, did the actual forms you're seeing change drastically, particularly in naturalization? Not so drastically, but still it's an important point to mark. Now, first, appropriately, I think we're going to start talking about immigration records. This engraving is you can see it was an illustrated image that appeared in the Graphic publication in 1884. Perhaps because of the large wave that had started then in the 1880s. It was a popular topic at the time, and this actual image I received through the Library of Congress. So, ship manifests. As we discussed, starting from 1820, passenger lists, also called ship manifests, listed all the passengers aboard steamships coming into the U.S. Early manifests required very little information beyond name, age, sex, country they were traveling from, country going to, and the class that the person was in, first, second, third, steerage, depending on, and all of these kind of varied really in that early period until really 1906, because the federal government was not so involved. The precise format of many early manifests depended exactly where and when the ship company bought their stationery sometimes, and the precise port of disembarkation, also known as when they got off the boat, or where, I should say. Now, I have just to kind of show you how this was not a federal process or a government process, I have here two examples from two headers of different ship manifests from 1855. And you can see here that these are different places where the steamship company actually bought their paper, where they bought their stationery, where they could then handwrite the passengers' names. These are both in the District of New York. These were both in New York, the same port. One of these stationery printers happened to be at 25 Pine Street, near the customs house. And this was actually a common place where these printers were located so that they were for ease of access for the companies. And the other one was on Nassau and Cedar Street, also local to the port. So you could buy from any number of these companies, and that would kind of make up what your list looked like. As time went on, Congress passed a number of different acts relating to the regulation of passenger ships, often bringing them more and more under federal rather than state control. The acts often required more information of passengers listed on the manifest, which was nice for genealogists. I don't know how nice it was for them, but these often were intended. The same acts were also intended to improve the health of passengers on board. For instance, like the Passenger Act of 1882. Now, I put an asterisk here because you might think to yourself at first, wow, they cared to pass a law that was protecting the health of the passengers and the immigrants. That's an interesting, almost very liberal kind of idea that they were so concerned with those immigrants. Well, the truth of the matter was that in the 1880s, they were immigration officials or officials in state governments in particular, particularly New York, were very concerned about the spread of disease, particularly cholera, typhus, and oftentimes those originated on these boats because of the conditions. So by trying to enact certain protections, maybe give people a bit more space, they thought it might be more likely that they could stave off some of those infections. Whether or not those early laws actually did that is a subject for another time. Nevertheless, so as we kind of discussed a bit earlier, the best year for genealogists looking for their ancestors' passenger lists are often seen after 1906. 1906 is this magical year where the manifest extended to include extremely valuable genealogical information, including the exact town of birth rather than simply where the person previously had their residence, and a relative in the old country and where that person lived, sometimes even an address, and who that immigrant was going to meet. And as I said, these still got more and more detailed as time went on. Now, if you take one thing away from this entire webinar and one thing only, it is pleased to look if your ancestor's passenger manifest has a second page. I recently came across a client who wanted me to find where her family was from, and she had found her ancestor's passenger manifest, I think, at least a decade before she had traveled to Ellis Island. She had gotten a copy of the manifest, and she never realized that there was a second page which said exactly where her grandfather was born. So please, if you have not done so already, or when you are starting to look for these documents, please look, especially at after 1906, if there are more pages, even just to look around and see who are the other passengers on the ship. Maybe they might be related to you. Just because they're not necessarily on the same line or right next to them doesn't mean they might not be important for your research. So this is the first document we're going to be looking at. And this is interesting for a few different reasons I picked this. This particular manifest is actually from before that year 1906. This is from 1902. This manifest is the manifest actually of my great-great-grandfather, Reuven, aka Robert Freese, who was, as you can see here, he was 26 at the time of disembarkment. He was a laborer. He was Austrian. Now, this can be very important, even if it's not very specific, because if your ancestor arrived during a period where there was lots of changing borders, if you pay lots of attention, make a research log of exactly where they said they were, or where they said, or the country they said they were in on different dates, you can actually sometimes narrow down somewhat more where they were, because certain towns went over borders. So if it was in 1914, or if in 1913 they were in one country, and in 1918 they say in the census they were from Poland, that might be an indication where they were. Besides for that, we also have on this list, where did he live prior to coming to America? And this was, says Jedlova. And he was going to New York, and he was actually going to join his mother. Now, this was very interesting to me when I first saw this record, because I had no idea prior to looking at this record that his mother ever came to America. And not only does it say that he was going to join his mother in America, but it gives her exact address. It says Mrs. Freese, mother, who lived at 206 Delancey Street in New York. Now, I said this is considered before that kind of very valuable, but just to show you that all these records can give so much valuable information. And I want you to kind of take a look yourself at the original image, not just what's indexed. But indexed, I mean what's written out on Ancestry or Family Search, however you get to your records. Look at the original image and see, is there anything here that A, may be wrong in the index, or that's not indexed at all? And this can give you the best, sometimes the best clues to how to get further in your research. And in this case, I found I had a great grandmother who I could look into. And it turns out, actually, I'll tell you, she is the reason I didn't know that she existed, or that she came to America, is because only a few years after she came to America, she passed away. And she is buried about half a mile from where I live today in Brooklyn, which was crazy. So going back into Reuben Fries. This is a kind of interesting list, which only really started appearing about 1902, 1903. And this was the record of detained alien passengers. Now, this is not going to be around necessarily for the majority, but there will be some. And sometimes you actually might find this record before you find the more detailed record, which is, even though they're both from the same ship logs. So if you kind of scroll a few pages forward or backward, you will find often the original record. But let's get a bit into it. So what was happening here? For all different number of reasons, the passengers were detained, because might have been that the person that was supposed to meet them did not arrive. They were thought that if they let them off the boat, they would become a public charge. If they were sick, that was a really big one. If they were sick, or they thought that they were had any mental or physical incapacity, that was the reason to kind of keep them for any number of days. And depending on how long they may have been detained, there might be more files with information on them. It happens to be, luckily for my grandfather, great-grandfather Reuben, Robert, he was not there actually for very long. You can see here, he was maybe there for 26 hours. You can see, it says here, and the way that you get that information is, you can see, this is the time the ship arrived on May 12th, 1902 at 10:45 a.m. And we go here, this is, when was he discharged from this lovely little detainment? And that was, I think he was line 5, so we know 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So he was discharged at 12:30 on March 13th. So that's how we know he was detained for about 26 hours. It also says here, it's kind of, I faded it out accidentally, that the amount of meals that he was served, and those were provided by, or paid for by, the steamship company, because they were trying to kind of giving that level of accountability to making sure that if someone was getting on the boat, that they were able to stay in America, because the government didn't want people coming in that couldn't stay, because it was a whole, deporting someone is not a pleasant experience for any of the parties involved, obviously. So what happened with Reuben? Well, as you can see here it actually says exactly where he is in the manifest. So if you find this record before your regular passenger record, it says he is on group K. Group K, that also means page K. There'll be a big K on the top of your manifest, and we can actually go back. Let me see. See the big K here on the top right? That's what that is indicating. So you can see here that he was in group K. He was number 24 on that list. The cause of detention, his mother didn't show up, I guess, in New York. And it looks like actually what happened is his brother, Yusuf, came and picked him up instead, and it gives his address. And this is all information just from looking at the ship manifest. So not only can we get so much insight into maybe where to go next for our research, but just to give us more color to our ancestor stories, which is incredibly important. So we don't have extensive time to go into every single type of manifest today because we picked these topics, because I picked naturalization and immigration for one talk, which, as I said, each talk of those you can go into for about 5 hours. I want to point you to where we at JewishGen have a lot more information where you can read up on passenger manifests. So I want to point you to the info files. Now, the info files you might know, oh, okay, you're looking here, the countries. You're not doing that. You're not going to click one of those. What you're going to do is, I'm going to show you. You're going to scroll down the page on the JewishGen/info files/ You're going to scroll down. You're going to go all the way down here until you get to immigration and emigration. And you have there all these different insights into all different things you can learn about passenger arrivals, manifests, where to get them, films, manifest markings, which I'll talk a little bit about. Just a wealth of information we have on the JewishGen website where you can go deeper into these topics. You can also obviously go on NARA and USCIS, but this was to give you a taste of what that manifest looks like. So here you can see this is the info file /manifest. Actually, you can even just put that in. And this is from Marian L. Smith, and she is one of the experts historian on all things ship manifests and naturalization records. She's written numerous articles in all different publications. And if you want to look deeper into your specific manifest and you're trying to decode what are all these little markings mean, what does this say? You want to read this info file because it is an amazing wealth of information, and it is there on JewishGen for you. So I'm going to briefly touch on these other types of manifests. Because, as I said, people did not only come to America just by ship, even though that was most common. They also came by airplane and by crossing the border by land. Border crossings started being recorded about 1895. Before that, the government was not particularly interested in people coming over by land for whatever reason. And this is common also in Europe, that it can be harder to find records for land crossings because it was just less relevant to them. Airplane manifests started with the advent of passenger air travel, obviously. But the other thing I wanted to point out, just in looking at these two pictures, is that not all files under the category of what we're calling immigration records, strictly speaking, are actually immigration files. So I have two images here. The one below is a border crossing card. This is actually a border crossing card from Canada, and this is for Rabbi Schneur Cutler, that's all, who is a famous rabbi in the Orthodox community. And this card was when he immigrated to the US. The details here are fairly extensive, as this is a much later card, obviously. I think this is 1948. And these actually were occasionally updated from various points in the immigration process, this card. But the wealth of information you get on one of these cards, if you happen to have a relative who had it, you have grandfather, who his grandfather was, Israel Zalman Meltzer. You have his father, Aaron Cutler, who was also a very well-known rabbi, and different information actually when he came into America, all different sorts of information, which you can kind of dive deeper into. So if you have a relative, often actually what's interesting about these records is that, as I said, late after 1940, or in the later years when people came in, sometimes it was not so easy to come legally into this country. So, and if you did not come legally into this country, sometime you might have had a need to come in legally for naturalization purposes. So they could write that on your documents. So sometimes what you will find, actually people left, went to Toronto, and then came back so they could say that this is when they legally came into the US. So then they might have a border crossing card for that purpose. Now this record is actually talks about Schneer's father, or Aaron Cutler's, that's all, who was mentioned over here. Said destination he was going to was his father and his father's address. So I'm including this record. This is obviously an air passenger manifest from 1950. And I'm including this record because to show, as we discussed, not all records were immigration records. Now, I think this is probably not considered an immigration for all record for all of these people. As you can see here on line 9, Cutler Aaron was already a US citizen at this point. He had traveled to Israel and was coming back at that point from that visit. So as you can see, all different US citizens, Israeli citizens, there might be a mix on any of your manifests. Oftentimes, especially on ship manifests, they will actually have divided the manifests based on aliens versus citizens, but they will still be in the same files and microfilms. So you will find both. And I think we actually had someone come into the museum just last week or the week before who came across a actually, I think it was a Visa card for her grandfather going to Brazil, which even had his picture on it. And she said, wait, this doesn't make any sense. I know this is my grandfather, but he'd never lived in Brazil. And sure enough, I said, don't worry, this is not, he was not immigrating to Brazil. He was traveling to Brazil. And these records, though not immigration, technically immigration, quote unquote, records, strictly speaking, were very valuable, even if they were just for the purposes of business. In this woman's case, she got a picture of her grandfather and the names of his parents. So now we're going to kind of segue into the naturalization files, because we talked about there's some people who are visiting and there's some people who are immigrating. And for the people who are immigrating, they might potentially have some of these files. Not all of them, because not everyone went through the naturalization process, but a good amount of them did. And if you can find these records, they can be incredibly valuable to your searches. And the efficiency of you're going back onto some of the JewishGen databases in Europe and saying, oh, where can I find this grandfather, this person? All these US-based files can really make those searches more efficient and give you more information to confirm people are actually your relatives. So the first document, appropriately, I think, we're going to discuss is the Declaration of Intention. And as I said, from 1795, this was the first step in the whole process of naturalization for about 160 years. Filing a Declaration of Intention was the first formal step towards US naturalization for most people between 1795 and 1952. Now, I say most people because there were a few exemptions where someone did not necessarily need to file a Declaration of Intention, but for the most part, most people did have to file them during that period of time. Depending on when it was filed, there were different US residency requirements to be met prior to making the declaration. If it was before 1906, these requirements depended on state, so where it was filed. And early on, the declaration was seen as a safeguard, ensuring that the immigrants demonstrated their loyalty before being granted the privileges of citizenship. However, this caused a bit of confusion for often new immigrants English may not have been perfect, if they're at all. Often immigrants failed to realize that this was only the first step of this process. These were the first papers. They were not a US citizen, despite the fact that actually, depending on the exact state and time, these first papers actually could grant various privileges that you might think would only be given to citizens. For instance, in a number of states, if you filed your first papers, you could actually vote, which seems counterintuitive. You could do all different things, and it really depends on exactly where and when this record was declared. But this was an open court process. And I said, over time it's evolved from, before 1906, where it was, you could do it basically anywhere. It could be done in your local basically your most convenient would maybe your local probate court, your city court, your county, your state, and that makes those records much harder to find. Not impossible by any means, but they're harder to find. They might have less information. Over time, the process evolved with significant reforms, as I said, in 1906 under the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization and later USCIS, and this standardizes the forms and procedures to address the inconsistencies in those state and local courts. As the laws and procedures became stricter, the documents became more detailed. So if you are lucky enough to have someone who came later, they had to go through a much more lengthy process for immigration, but those documents will give you much more information about their lives. Declarations of intention issued on or after July 1st of 1929 included a space for a paragraph of the declarant, though not every copy of this document will have the photo. There were typically 3 copies. And for whatever reason, I think that often actually people will come across on Ancestry in particular, if you are looking for your naturalization record, it is quite frequent. The first record that you see pop up might be the copy which does not have the photo. Now, Ancestry and Family Search might actually have that photo also digitized, but it might just be that you have to kind of look and see if there's a different collection where it is in. But I would encourage you, if you have a Declaration of Intention after 1929 and it doesn't see you don't find a picture there, to look and see if there are other resources where you can find that picture. And if you can't find it online, you can also order it from NARA. Now let's look at kind of deep into the evolution of the Declaration. Look at the actual images. So as we said early on, very bare bones. This was quite literally as it says, a declaration of intention. I, Morris Hirsch, am denouncing allegiances and fidelity. He's announcing his intent. This is his intention to become a citizen of the United States and to forever renounce all allegiances and fidelity to any other prince, state, sovereignty, etc., and particularly to the Emperor of Russia. Now, sometimes you'll have here this type of declaration. It'll say the specific name of the Tsar or Emperor. Sometimes it will just say Russia, but these vary greatly to the various points, and they are extremely difficult, especially if you have a common name, to pinpoint exactly who this person is and how they're related to you. And as I said, this one was from 1895. Now we go on a bit more. Now we're going to go back to look at, again, my great-grandfather, Robert Freese. Now this is the original Declaration of Intention. This was the copy that was filed in the court. And you can see there is so much more information here. From his age and his physical disposition. He was 5'5", apparently. In terms of genealogical information, he was born in, well, it says here, Galicia, Austria. So that is somewhat more specific than if he had said Austria, but that is a pretty general region, so that would require more research, obviously. When he thinks he was born was approximately 1883, in October of 1883. His address, so that is an easy way to confirm if you have your ancestors' census record already. You can cross-reference their address with that census record to see where they were located. He immigrated through the port of Rotterdam, and you see the ship, which we looked at. says his wife's name, Fanny, a little bit general, but that's what, and she was also from Austria, quote unquote, the same address. And at this point, you have kind of these port information, which you didn't have previously, and that's from a certificate of arrival, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But the next record, so this, to give you, just to kind of give you, as I said, the evolution of the Declaration of Intention. This is a 1947 Declaration of Intention, and this was for Solomon Leib Halberstam, also known affectionately by his Hasidim as Reb Shloima of Bobov Zatzal. He was a very well-known Hasidic Rebbe in America. And it's funny that I love using rabbis as examples, because I often find people will look everywhere except for US records to look for information or images of these people. And look how incredible that photo is of him. But anyways, the Declaration has, as you can see, 1947, this was kind of towards the end of this period where these were required, has a lot more information. This is all written with a typewriter. You can see here we have where if he had left the US and returned, this is in 1947. So this is post-war, or approximately. So there was probably not much of that going on right then, but if it had, it would have been here, most likely. And you have all different information about him on these records, which gives you a really good background. He was a widower, and it gives his former wife's name from Europe. And so, as I said, this is kind of just the very brief look. And now the next slide, we're going to go into a much more detailed look at one of these more extensive declarations of intention. So this example is from April 1940. And I've extracted the information from this Declaration of Intention for Clara Silverman over here and basically I made this in Excel. Oftentimes my research logs I will make in Excel. Sometimes I will make them using kind of more fancy, quote unquote, genealogical software. But on a very basic level, I would encourage everyone who is looking at these documents to independently, as I said, look at the image and try to extract the information yourself to see if there's anything that may have been misspelled on the index, any information that wasn't indexed at all, because there is information that was not indexed here. And you can see all different fields here. So you have the detail, name, address, occupation, her birthday, her birthplace and town, her husband's name, his birthday, when they were married, where to get that vital record and when, their last foreign residence, their children, both residing where they were born and where they now reside. And so this record was actually from Connecticut. And this foreign port of departure. So this is where her ship left from, where she came into, and of course, under which name? Haya Flamenbaum. Now, if you did not know your ancestor's maiden name, this document, if you were not aware, which is from the Certificate of Arrival, which I'll kind of briefly look at next, this can give you that name that you have been looking for. The main point here is that if we start with best practices and really looking into these records, it makes all of your research easier, more efficient, effective, and you get much more out of what you're looking at. So this is, again, using Rabbi Cutler here. So this is, and I didn't actually use his declaration of intention because, as you can see here, it is not really that easy to read. Oh wait, oh no. It is not very easy to read. It's kind of blurry. So that's why I didn't actually use his declaration as our example. However, I wanted to look at his certificate of arrival here because this certificate of arrival, if you're looking at a naturalization file, this is the type that you will often find on Ancestry or Family Search, these images. in microfilm. This would have been attached at the back of the typically or behind the Declaration of Intention. Now, at this time period, actually, I believe it was at least before 1940, around this time, was the certificate of arrival was actually one of the first kind of preliminary step to the creation of this more lengthy document. If you've ever wondered kind of how they get the certificate of arrival, a lot goes into it, especially with people who have very different names and they don't really, these people couldn't remember their birthdays. How do they remember the exact ship, port, how their name was spelled in the manifest? Well, they didn't. The preliminary forms asked questions like their father's full name, their mother's name, her married name, and all of those kinds of preliminary forms are really not accessible. I will refer you to Renee Carl's P-file class for more on that, but I'm going to leave it as this is an introduction, that those files are not so accessible. However, this should give you some insight in terms of what goes into this certificate of arrival. There's a lot. And this is also one of the few things that the government really checked and made sure this was accurate, how they got in. This was what they were really concerned with. The actual things like where someone was born, where the dates, all that stuff. And I can tell you here right now, where it says Sver, Poland, that is not accurate. That is not where he was. It says he was born there. He was not. The date of birth, those are not necessarily accurate. Now, it might be more accurate depending on where and when those records were found, but this particular record is not so accurate. But I can tell you this record, this certificate of arrival, is very accurate because the government was diligently checking and making sure they knew exactly when you came into the country. And if it was or wasn't done legally, if there was a visa attached, what that was, all of those kinds of information. But most of this information from the certificate of arrival will actually be transferred onto the Declaration of Intention if you're looking closely. Okay, so. Oh, and before I move on, I want to just make a brief note. So this particular file might also be interesting because this file is not digitized. Not every naturalization file that exists is digitized, unfortunately. Some of the later ones, depending on exactly the court, when and where, so a lot of those still, well, not a lot, but there are some specific sets which you can only find in specifically later years through NARA. Now, unfortunately, I ordered this a couple years ago from NARA, New York, which unfortunately no longer is in working order, and those files are all on their way to Philadelphia. So if I wanted to order this right now, I probably actually could not do it for a few months until those were relocated. But the general point is that keep looking, especially if you know it more or less that they have a naturalization file. Not everyone did. If you know they have a naturalization file, keep looking. Sometimes they might just not be on the internet yet. So they're where you can order from. Now we're going to kind of touch on the petition for naturalization. This is the final paper. So now I'm going to do this a bit briefly because of time constraints and the fact that oftentimes these documents did not differ too extensively from each other. It really depended exactly the time frame from when the declaration was filed and when the petition was filed and what laws might have been passed between those two times. So as we said, on some of the later declarations, they did have the information here, which I have here in the petition, which is for my grandfather, which is his children and their dates of birth and their place of birth. But on Robert's declaration, those were not there because those were not required at the time. And it's important to get both of those files and to see, compare and contrast what you can get from both of them. The other thing that I don't think I mentioned was that you will have oftentimes so when someone actually took their citizenship oath, they would have petitioners, witnesses. Sometimes these would be friends. Sometimes they would be relatives that live nearby. but you want to make a note of those people also. And every document that you find, even though it might look initially like they have about, oh, this has the same information, it's coming from the same place. Well, depending on the exact years, exact details, these backstory, it might have one critical fact that you were missing. So now I know that some people are probably thinking, well, now how do I find these records? Well, unfortunately, as I said, it is a little bit to give you a class on every element of this process and how to find these records, how to give you kind of the tips and tricks to go back to find the different spellings that your ancestors might have used, the exact databases. I could give you a few more hours to do that. But I wanted this class to kind of give you an idea of what's going on here and what you're looking for. And when you find it, what you should do with those records and how you should process them and look at them. So the resources I have here are where you can start your search. The first being Family Search, which is free. You have to log in, but it is free. Ancestry, most people are aware. Steve Morse has one-step tools. They have different tools that Ancestry and Family Search might not have to kind of search those databases. And then if you know specifically that your family member came through New York, you can also use statueofliberty.org, which is also another free website. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating and very informative. There are a lot of questions. We only have about 10 minutes. So if you want to look through the Q&A and take a look to see what might be relevant for the larger audience, and we'll try to get through as many as possible.
Oh, wow. I see 76. Okay. First of all, is there a handout? Right now, there is not. I actually created this talk just for this webinar. I might be able to see if I can put one together this week to kind of give you a few of the things which I think would be important to kind of key points, but unfortunately, I didn't have time right before this. Let's see, Pat W. I found trying to read the name of the ship and town difficult to understand cursive writing on records. Any ideas without hiring someone how to understand the writing? So one tip for how to understand some of the writing is that you can kind of try to compare and contrast look at the page as a whole and see what words in cursive can you actually read yourself. What names do you know? And even though you might not necessarily, you can figure out those letters and you can compare and contrast those to what you have. And also, it said you can look at the index because oftentimes they will have some version of what is going on there on the index. So that can be helpful. I think also on that info file actually that I shared from Marian Smith on JewishGen, they have, she has some suggestions and some tips and tricks for that. Okay. Will we get this? Oh, wait, hold on. Sorry, I went down to. Will we get the slides? I believe the slides, you will receive the video of this webinar at some point in the near future. Okay, let me go down. I found a handwritten note, my mother's papers. It should, so someone is asking here that he saw that on his first papers, also, as I said, the Declaration of Intention, he saw that there was an Israel Fisher arriving on a ship, which he could not find the ship specifically. He said he looked through hundreds of microfilms and I found no markers that were at their arrival. So if you could not find the ship at all, then I would look to see if there was a ship that came maybe a day or two before or after that time. And I would look very, very closely. And I know that you obviously looked very closely if you looked at through hundreds of microfilms. But There's also was a different indexes and books. Try a few different places, and that might be a time to hire a professional if you really have spent that long on that. Please talk about Sephardic immigration, especially from the Ottoman Empire in the 1880s and 1880s through 1920s. So I'm going to say I'm not actually an expert on that that particular field. Unfortunately, there was absolutely lots of immigration during that time, specifically because of wars between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. There was a lot of movement going on. One really good book that I like about on the kind of a Sephardi diaspora is called Forging Ties, Forging Passports, which is by Devi Mays, Devi Mays, Mays. And that is a really great book that kind of tells some of those stories. And another one of my colleagues actually at the museum, Michael Loss, is probably a much better expert to ask that question to. Okay. How much time do we have? There is a lot here.
Maybe we could take maybe 2 more questions.
Okay,
And
let
then
me
if you
see.
want, we could look through them afterwards and we could try to answer some or, for a future webinar.
Okay. Let's see. So someone said, did wives of men immigrating in the mid-19th century also apply for naturalization? In other words, did both partners of a married couple need to apply for naturalization or only men? And this is a very good question, actually, because I didn't address this and I meant to. So thank you so much, Jim, for asking this question. Up until a certain point, I believe, off the top of my head, approximately 1920, I want to say, women did not need to apply for naturalization. They around that time they actually could get automatic citizenship with their husband. Likewise, on the other end, if a woman actually married a man who was not a citizen, say she married a man who, before he became a citizen, she would actually lose her citizenship. And she was no longer considered a U.S. citizen, and then she had to apply again for naturalization. She had to apply for naturalization without the declaration of intention, because that was one of those very few exceptions to that rule. But thank you so much for that question, because that is actually really important. And one last question. Did people have to become naturalized, and what is alien status, and are there alien records? People did not have to become naturalized. I have a grandfather who was in this country for, I think, something like 50 years, actually. And he just decided he never wanted to be naturalized for whatever reason. Maybe it was political, I'm not really sure. And the reason I know that specifically is because on his, I believe it was the 1940 census, don't quote me on that, on different census records, it will say if they filed their first papers, if they were naturalized, if they were aliens. And so what is alien status? Alien means that they were foreigners, they were not citizens of the US. And all of these records that I'm talking about pertain to aliens. And now, if there were enemy aliens, there are very specific records that would pertain to those individuals, which can be quite detailed, but that is for another day. So thank you so much for asking all of these questions. And oh, there are over 100 now. Wow, that is so impressive. Thank you guys so much for all being here. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really wonderful, and it was clear and informative, and we thank you. And we're going to be inviting you for more webinars in the future. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today. I hope you will join us a week from today for our next talk with Jarrett Ross. His topic will be Challenges of DNA for Jews Overcoming Endogamy. Should be a very interesting program as well. We will be sending out the recording following probably before the end of the week, probably on Friday, if we can't do it today. Tomorrow is an off day here in the United States. There will also be a survey. If you could please complete it and also let us know if you have suggestions for topics you would like us to cover in the future. So for those of you in the United States, I wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Have a good day, everybody.
Take care, everyone.